Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Ancient Philosophy Podcast. I'm Doug Campbell, an assistant professor of philosophy at Alma College in Michigan, and I'm also the host of the Ancient Philosophy Podcast, which is the podcast that explores important topics in ancient philosophy, whether that's in Greece, Rome, India, the Near East, China, or beyond. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about a topic in ancient science. Specifically, we're going to be talking about where our concept of organs develops, where our concept of organs develops. And for the purposes of this episode, organ is going to be defined as an anatomical structure that has a purpose or a function. It, in other words, helps with some physiological process in the body. For that reason, we use the word organ. It comes from the Greek word organon, which means tool or instrument, and that's related to words like organic, for instance. And so when we talk about organic bodies in normal English or organic tissue, we're talking about a concept that originates in classical Greece, the end of the classical period in the 300s BC or the 4th century BC. And organ, for the purposes of this episode, is contrasted with organ as a concept is contrasted with body part or mere part of the body, which just refers to any old anatomical structure, even when it doesn't have a purpose or a function. So we can think, for example, our earlobe is a part of our body, but we wouldn't really refer to it as an organ because it doesn't do anything. And it might surprise us, or might surprise some of us, that the ancient Greeks, generally in the classical period, didn't operate with a conception of organ. They instead operated with a conception of mere parts of the body. And so then there was this puzzle. Well, how do ancient people do physiology? So by physiology, I'm referring to the study of the functioning of our body's anatomical structure. So again, physiology is the functioning of our body's anatomical structures. Your eyes do a certain thing. They facilitate sight, and for that reason, we refer to eyes as organs, and people study the physiology of the eyes. How do the eyes do things? Physiology is to be contrasted with anatomy. So anatomy is just the study of the body's anatomical structures. If you were to describe the brain as wrinkly, you'd be doing anatomy. But when you began to talk about how different parts of the brain secrete different neurotransmitters, you'd be doing physiology instead. And of course, they're closely related because today the way we do physiology is in terms of describing how anatomical structures do certain things. But that's exactly what the ancient Greeks early in the classical period did not do. They did not describe anatomical structures such that they accomplish something, such that they do things. What I mean by that is that early Greek scientists and thinkers in, did physiology without attributing activities to anatomical structures. They did not believe in organs. They didn't have a concept of organ. And today, what I want to talk about is how Plato invented the concept of organ, building on what his predecessors had done. And I'll describe who his predecessors were and what they thought momentarily. And then at the very end of the episode, I'll mention briefly the legacy of this idea. I'll look at Aristotle and I'll look at Galen. But the major focus here, I think, will be on the Plato's predecessors and Plato's achievement. The argument that I'm going to be sketching here comes from a book that I have written called Plato's Biology that's forthcoming with Cambridge University Press, should be out later this year in 2026. But I don't think that my characterization of the ancient scientific landscape is particularly controversial. Some of the lines of thinking here will be recognizable to those who know the work of Brooke Holmes, for example, or Colin Webster in his recent book, Tools in the Organism, which came out with University of Chicago Press, I think in 2023, maybe 2022. But the idea here is that Plato takes a concept of mere body part from Hippocratic authors and then turns it into a concept of organ. And then later people like Aristotle and Galen run with this idea, and then we've inherited it ourselves, and that's why we talk about organs of the body, bodily organs. So, who were these Hippocratic authors I just mentioned, and what do they think? Well, coming down to us from antiquity, there are these medical texts that we call the Hippocratic corpus. Corpus meaning body, as in body of text, sets of texts. And the Hippocratic authors are people who wrote these texts anonymously. So they didn't sign their name to these texts. And then later in antiquity, someone, most likely in the third century BC in Alexandria, but it is possible that that story is wrong. But it's most likely that someone in the third century BC in Alexandria compiled these texts and put them together and attributed them to this ancient physician, Hippocrates, who most likely really existed, but also most likely really didn't write anything. Today, some of us will be familiar with the Hippocratic Oath, which is closely associated with phrases like do no harm as a set of prescriptions, very, very basic prescriptions for the conduct of healthcare workers. That Hippocratic Oath is coming from a text called The Oath, that is one of the Hippocratic texts that says things like doctor should swear to do no harm, for example. You could think of it as like professional guidelines, such that people who swore the oath would have their conduct be regulated. It is not really possible that all of these texts were written by the same person. I mean, it would be straining credulity. We find different linguistic styles, different bodies of knowledge. We also find that the texts seem to disagree among each other. I don't mean that a certain text disagrees with itself, but that text A disagrees with text B on certain things. And we actually find different approaches to medicine entirely cataloged to this corpus. Even if someone wanted to maintain that they were written by the same person, which, as I said, I don't, which like scholars drastically do not take seriously that possibility, but certainly no one would attribute them to the actual Hippocrates. Yes, there most likely was a guy, Hippocrates, but most likely he wrote nothing. Now, one way we can be sure of that is that these texts were not written by Hippocrates or even by the same person, is that they represent different stages in ancient medical thinking. So most likely, again, most likely, I can't speak in terms of guarantees, but these texts were predominantly written at the end of the 5th century BC. We could be off by a few decades, but generally at the end of the 5th century BC. Some, however, were written much later. Some were even written way after Aristotle's death. So, as we would say, in the Hellenistic period, as opposed to, say, in the mid-classical period, which would be the fifth century BC, late 5th century BC. Some of these texts were written in the 200s BC, so the 3rd century BC. And it's striking to observe just generally, like some of these thinkers know way more about internal anatomy than others. And that's because ones who were writing in the Hellenistic period benefited from like dissections that had happened in the Hellenistic period in Alexandria. I'm thinking, for example, of the text on the heart. Another thing that you notice when you look at some of these texts is that some of the authors seem to operate with the understanding of organ that we more closely associate with Plato and Aristotle. That is a part of the body that does something, that has a purpose, that has a function. And so we can see that some of these authors are influenced by developments in philosophical thinking about scientific concepts like organ. Plato and Aristotle actually make an influence on some of these authors, but some of these authors are writing when Plato is a young man, before his writing career started. Some of these authors might have been writing before Plato even was born in 428 BC, although not many, I think, were written that early, but it's possible. And certainly many of these authors are writing before Aristotle was even born in 384 BC. So when we look at these authors, we notice that the majority of them who precede Plato's writing career do not have a concept of organ. Instead, they believe that there are these anatomical structures that don't really do anything. And the reason why they think that anatomical structures don't really do anything is chiefly because they have a hard time imagining that our body can do something that doesn't rise to the level of our conscious awareness. Okay, again, the central thought here is that it is not really possible for our body to do something that does not rise to the level of our conscious awareness. If something escapes our awareness, it's not really our body doing it. If something escapes our awareness, it's not really our body doing it. So I'm going to name one such contraction or movement in our body right now that contemporary science tells us is happening, namely the motion of peristalsis, which is a wave-like contraction that our intestines are responsible for in order to push food through the digestive system. Now, that is something that our bodies are doing, and therefore, in one way or another, we are doing it. We are moving food through our digestive system. However, we don't know that we're doing that. We actually need science to tell us that that's doing it. That's not something that we're consciously aware of doing, and it's certainly not within our voluntary control. It's therefore very different from voluntary conscious movements like the raising of my arm. Now, maybe I have some kind of spasm or something that is causing the motions of my arm to not be fully within my control. Surely that's something that could happen. I might lose control over my body's movements, but I would know that my body is doing that. I would know that my arm is moving up, right? I would feel it moving up and I would just go like, that's weird. My arm is moving up and I don't have control over that, but I know it's happening. That stands in serious contrast to the way that our digestive system is responsible for motions that escape the conscious awareness of our mind entirely. And therefore, ancient Greeks, by and large, do not believe in these things. They don't believe that these motions are happening. If we had to put a contemporary scientific spin on this, we would say that ancient Greek thinkers are not aware of the autonomic nervous system. That there's a part of our nervous system that controls things without our conscious involvement or conscious awareness. How much of some hormone are your pituitary glands spitting out right now? How much of some chemical is your hypothalamus spitting out right now? There's all of this complex machinery in our body that's being carefully controlled, right? Our body is engaging in a very complicated process of not just digesting food and producing hormones in exactly the right amount, by the way, in proportion to maintain healthy proportions in our body, right? Ideally help us maintain homeostasis. Our body's also regulating its own temperature. That's all happening beneath the level of our awareness, and there's a part of our nervous system that is pulling the strings. And thankfully, in order to not overload ourselves with information, our body is sort of smoothing that out. Our mind is smoothing that out so that we don't have to think about it. The problem is that because these things are happening beneath our awareness, the ancient Greeks are literally don't think that they exist, that these motions happen. And therefore, they do not believe that these anatomical structures, of which they're not really deeply aware, they don't believe that these anatomical structures are actually doing anything. They don't believe that they have some kind of activity. Now, that's not to say that they're totally unaware of these structures or totally aware of them. I've recorded and put out a previous episode on this subject about the ancient Greeks avoiding dissections generally, and therefore being unaware of internal anatomy. That moment I mentioned in Alexandria earlier in this episode about the dissections and information gleaned from anatomical information that is gleaned from dissections of human beings. That's a very, very small, brief moment in the history of ancient science. The vast majority of ancient science is done without dissections of humans, and therefore the ancient Greeks are generally unaware of internal anatomy. Now, not totally unaware. So they did animal dissections. You see that represented even in some of our earliest Hippocratic texts, like on the sacred disease. And we have other sources like Herodotus that make it be likely that animal dissection was even if not commonplace, was at least uncontroversial, was done casually and cited by intellectuals, researchers, philosophers, and scientists, and so on. So the idea here is that there are these anatomical structures. Different authors know about these internal anatomical structures to varying degrees. But, the intestines were something that you could be aware of through animal dissections, from observations related to sacrificing entrails, through war wounds, and so on. Like the earliest thinkers in this period might not know, for example, about the different parts, the different substructures of the intestines, like the jejunum and duodenum and things like this. But they're generally aware of the structures involved. And like Plato, for example, writing in the first half of the 4th century BC, can describe the intestines as coiled, even if he's not aware of all the substructures. And I do think that by that time in the 4th century BC, some thinkers actually are aware of substructures of the intestines. The idea here is that there are these structures that are just sort of, are vaguely mysterious, but not super mysterious. And the thinkers are reluctant to attribute to the motions because, like, we're used to attributing motions to and movements to our arms because we can consciously move them. And so the fact we have no conscious control over our intestines suggested to these thinkers that they don't actually do anything. They don't actually do anything. With that in mind, we can say that's one reason why the ancient thinkers thought that these were not organs, but instead merely body parts. Parts of the body that don't really do anything, that are known for their inertness or passivity. Instead, they function as receptacles, sites for other things that are active to do these jobs. This is how Hippocratic authors generally did physiology. So I'm going to read, here's a quick passage from Colin Webster's book, Tools in the Organism, where he says, the Hippocratic authors more often cast liquids, heat, air, and other such substances as the active agents, not the corporeal structures or parts, end quote. That captures the idea very well. The Hippocratic authors don't think that the structures themselves are active, but instead the active things are these liquids and so on in the body. So the major the major liquids or fluids are sometimes also called humors, but I do think a better translation of the Greek, or at least a more faithful translation of the Greek, would be fluids or liquids. The Hippocratic theory of the humors, or Hippocratic humoral theory, is most associated with a version of the theory that says there are these four humors in the body: yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm. The version of Hippocratic humoral theory that is most common says that health is achieved from a correct balance of these things. A very tight, delicate balance or proportion needs to be achieved of these four humors, for fluids or liquids, in order to be healthy. And disease comes about when the proportion's disturbed. Now, to be sure, there are Hippocratic texts that say nothing on this subject, and there are Hippocratic texts like On Diseases 4, for instance, that have different lists of the humors. Uh, uh, on Diseases 4, for example, considers water as one of the humors. But the general point stays the same, and I'm sure we'll do another episode on Hippocratic humoral theory. The general point here is that there are these chemicals, fluids, liquids, whatever you want to call them, compounds in the body that move in and out of substructures and or structures and substructures and cause different things. They cause different things to happen. So I'm going to give an example of one that doesn't involve a liquid or fluid, but that captures the idea here kind of well. Let's say you wanted to explain something physiological. You wanted to explain why the heart beats in the chest, right? You're not doing anatomy. You're not talking about how the heart is red or, has chambers or something like that. You're doing a very classic physiological thing. Why does the heart beat? Now, if you're an ancient Greek thinker, you do not believe that the heart always beats. You believe that the heart beats only when you can feel it and rises to the level of your awareness. You have no reason for thinking the heart always beats. And thinkers for a large chunk of antiquity don't know about related phenomena like the pulse at all, okay? So we're not saying that the heart is always beating, but it sometimes beats in our chest, when we're in an extremely stressful situation, for example. So you might say that that's fire causing the blood in your heart to boil and causing the heart to have this sensation that we today describe as thumping. Now, the heart, strictly speaking, is not moving, right? It's being moved. The heart is totally passive. It's being moved by the amount of blood that's sort of heating and boiling over there. And that would be the way that you could explain something physiological in terms of positing or hypothesizing just anatomical structures that are passive, and then thinking that there's something actually active there, which in this case would be fire. Now, fire is not strictly speaking some part of you, right? And so the Hippocratics are saying that, or the few who would actually give this very example, the Hippocratics are not saying that your heart is moving itself. They're right. They would instead say that fire is causing the blood to boil, and the fire that's actually active isn't really part of you. So it's not surprising that you're not consciously aware of the fire. And so you have theories of digestion of food, for example, where elements, for example, are breaking down the things that are being contained in the various anatomical structures. Or the heart, in this instance I just gave, was a receptacle in which blood is being contained and which fire happens to enter occasionally in such a quantity that it causes this sort of thing to happen. It causes the blood to boil over. So we can actually do physiology just by describing these active substances and their actions on passive or inert structures of the body. These structures we would just call body parts, not organs. So we find, for example, in on ancient medicine, descriptions, which is an ancient medical text on ancient medicine, the descriptions of the liver and spleen as spongy and porous. And like that's a bit of anatomy or anatomical thinking that's supposed to say something like, look, these structures have the ability to absorb the right sorts of fluids that they need in order to do their job. Now, absorption, not in some active sense where they're going out and absorbing things, but absorption in just the same way that sponges absorb water when you put a sponge in water. It's not like the sponge is acting, but it's just the water's moving around such that this passive thing receives and absorbs a bunch of water. Why? Because it's spongy and porous. Our liver and spleen can be the same thing. So that's how these thinkers are reasoning. And this is how some of their physiological theories get off the ground. Now, the interesting thing from the development of ancient philosophy and ancient science is that thinkers began to take some of these ideas and run with them and run with them. And Plato is an example of this in the Timaeus. So Plato wants to combine Hippocratic thinking with what today we refer to as teleology, which means something like the way that things are directed towards an end or a purpose or a goal. So Plato wants to combine Hippocratic thinking about anatomical structures with the goal directedness that we observe in anatomical structures. And Plato's combination is going to create the idea of an organ because the Hippocratic thinkers don't really believe, and if they believe this, they don't say it that they believe it, but they don't really seem to believe that that our anatomical structures are carefully created by a god or the gods. Now, some show some amount of religious reverence, and others are silent on such questions entirely. So I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but there's definitely no sense of like a deep creation myth about human beings in the Hippocratic corpus. There are some texts like on fleshes that start with a very, very broad cosmological focus and tell us about how like the whole cosmos was created from fire and then goes down right to the creation of our bodies. But like that's rare and that's a little different from what we're going to find in Plato because Plato in the Timaeus dedicates so much of his attention to arguing and developing a whole worldview where the gods have created not just the whole cosmos, but even the very structures of our body in accordance the good, in accordance with what's good for us. There's a head god whom we call the demiurge, coming from the Greek demiurgos, which means craftsman or craftsperson. And craftsman is a good name for this god because he acts like we'd expect a craftsman to act. He looks to a model, a blueprint, as it were, and then creates a product of craft in accordance with his expertise and knowledge, and also, importantly, his goodness. Now, Plato doesn't believe that the demiurge, God, the divine craftsman, creates every single thing in the cosmos. Instead, he creates the cosmos as a whole and then creates other gods who, in turn, create our body. And these gods are not as perfect. They have access to inferior materials, and so on. They're not perfect, but that's okay because they're not trying to make something immortal anyway. They're trying to make something mortal. And so these henchmen gods, whom we might call the lower gods or the young gods, the servant gods, these lower gods create the structures of our body, aiming to make us be as awesome as we can, but they're not fully capable of making us super awesome. And besides, as I said, that's not a huge defect because we're actually supposed to be mortal anyway. And Plato believes that these gods are responsible for the teleological dimension of our body structures. Teleology, again, meaning goal directedness. So if we were to think about what I just said in light of that, Plato's saying that These structures have a goal directedness to them. There's a function associated with them that exists because the lower gods created them to have this function. If someone wanted to know why why do pens have this function of writing? Why do they have this purpose of writing? So you would say because of the person who made pens. If you said, why does this bookmark have this function of being a bookmark, a purpose of being a bookmark? The teleological dimension of a bookmark, right, is keeping your place in a book. Why? Why is it the case? It's because it's someone made it, and that's why. That's why where it gets its teleological dimension from. And so Plato believes it's the same thing with the organs of our body. They have a teleological dimension, a goal, a purpose that is set by the intentions of the creators, of our creators. And so Plato takes this Hippocratic idea of a structure of the body, a mere body part, and combines it with a teleological dimension and creates a kind of a kind of concept of organ, right? Creates the concept of organ. Now, interestingly, Plato doesn't really generally disagree with the description of organs as passive, inert receptacles of things. So for example, your stomach contains food that the elements act on. Your stomach just sits there. Plato actually doesn't use the word for stomach ever, which is gaster, where we get words like gastroenterologist, and so on. That's a combination of different Greek words. Gaster and entera meaning entrails. It's also the Greek word for intestines, which is a word Plato does use, but gastroenterologist is a stomach intestine doctor. And so Plato doesn't actually use that word. He thinks of the stomach not as a like actual discrete organ, but just as like a belly, like a hollow cavity in our body. And it food just goes to sit there and elements act on them. Elements are the actual active thing, the four elements, fire, earth, and water. Plato doesn't really agree with Hippocratic humoral theory, but that's not to me say he denies the existence of yellow bile and black bile, but he doesn't share the Hippocratic commitment to humoral theory, so he's not going to cast the fluids as active agents in the body, although he does think that black bile and yellow bile and phlegm too can actually be very destructive. But Plato's more likely to think that in a healthy body, the things that are active are actually the elements. And so our organs achieve their purpose actually by just being passive receptacles. Generally, there's going to be a bit of complication in a second, but generally speaking, Plato conceives of organs as anatomical structures with a purpose, and they achieve that purpose by being passive or inert. Their purpose is set by the gods who created them and give them distinct functions, just as we might say a water bottle is made to hold water. That's its purpose. That's its teleological dimension. Just as we might say that that's what its purpose or goal is because its creator made them with that purpose in mind, so too would we say our ears are made to hear. That's their purpose. That's because the gods gave them that purpose. Now, how do ears actually facilitate hearing? Well, they do so by being canals, by passageways into which air can move and cause a kind of percussion. That percussion, that hitting, is what hearing is. Sound is the actual disruption of the airwaves, but the percussion is hearing, and then that percussive motion is transmitted ultimately to our soul, and so then our mind can register the sensory information. So similarly, sight, Plato believes that fire shoots out of our eyes and then connects with some external object, and then the external object disrupts that line of fire and it sort of bounces all the way back to our eyes. And for example, something will appear to be like glistening if the external object acted on this ray of fire in a way that's sharp and cutting. And so the idea is that the eye itself is actually purely passive. It's not actually actively shooting the air, but when we open our eyelids and open our eyes, the fire shoots out and then we are bombarded by this by the external world through the activity of it bouncing back on our eye through the ray of fire that our eye is shot out. It's sort of like the way a radar gun works when a police officer is scanning the cars for people's speed. The radar gun shoots something, it bounces back, and that's what causes the registration of the speed. In this case, that'd be the registration of something's visual traits or visual properties. For example, it being glistening. The eye is purely passive, but Plato believes that passivity is no bar to the activity or functioning of an organ, weirdly, right? Your eye is actually facilitating sight by means of these things that are the actual active agents. Now, and so Plato develops our concept of organ this way by taking on board the Hippocratic idea of anatomical structures as passive, but Plato combines it with this teleological dimension where like the gods have set all of this up to facilitate a physiological processes to help keep you alive and ultimately to get you to do philosophy and to have deep thoughts about the nature of the cosmos. Now, a few minutes ago, I said that things would get more complicated because Plato only generally believes the organs are active. There are actually a couple of exceptions. So the easy exceptions are ones I've already mentioned, things like the eyes. Like the eyes aren't actually shooting out fire. It's just so happens that fire is emitted from your eyes, and when your eyelids are closed, the eyelid is just keeping the fire inside. But the ear, for example, is something totally passive. The ear is actually just a canal or passageway. And weirdly, Plato doesn't describe the outer ear structure at all. And so he seems to think of the ear as simply a tunnel. But even some of his predecessors, like Empedocles, were aware of the inner ear to some degree. But Plato just thinks of the ear as a passageway or canal. Similarly with the nostrils too. And then, but the eyes are a harder one because we actually do emit fire. It's just not something our eyes are actually responsible for. It's just that there's a passageway for fire out of our eyes. A slightly harder one would be the heart, which beats in accordance with fire, boiling the blood over. I've already explained why that's not actually an instance of activity, though. Like the heart is passively being moved by boiling blood, and that blood is being boiled and turned by fire. So it can look like your heart is moving, but it's actually more like it's being moved. Right? If you're carrying around a big package and the package is being carried around by you, yes, in a way, package is moving, but more precisely, the package is being carried and moved. It's not actually moving itself. It's that someone is carrying around the package. The package is passive, moving at the whims of the person carrying it. The harder instances, the much more complicated and distinctive ones, are the reproductive organs. The uterus, the womb, which is what you'd call it if there were a fetus inside, the male genitals, these things move on their own without reference to any sort of elemental law governing the motions of the elements, right? This is part of you can think here like sexual arousal causes these things to move. For men, that's obvious. For women, there's a much more complicated thing happening where ancient Greeks believed in a thing called the wandering womb. Plato's the one who coins that term, which ultimately becomes known in hysteria as hysteria in later European history. That word is Greek, but it's not actually used by the Greeks. Plato's adopting this idea of a wandering womb from the ancient medical tradition. And I actually did another episode on that subject on the Wandering Womb, and I suggest people listen to it if you're interested in learning more about why ancient thinkers thought this. But ancient thinkers believe that the womb wanders through a woman's body, causing all sorts of ailments. Typically, breathing difficulties are the most common symptom associated with that. You see that in Plato's Timaeus too. And the idea is that for Plato, this is ultimately connected to a woman's desire for a child. That you're supposed to anchor the womb in place by getting her pregnant, conceiving a child. The child is in the womb, anchoring it in place. Different thinkers, typically the Hippocratic thinkers, like in texts like Diseases of Women, will say different things, and people come up with different cures. As I said, I talk about this in another episode on the Wandering Womb in particular. But the point is that for Plato, ultimately the motions of the male genitals and the womb are connected to sexual desire and arousal, and they're not things that we as men and women have control over. We don't have control over these motions. We are aware of the arousal. We feel the arousal, but we're not aware of the motions. And so we come back to that important idea I mentioned earlier that if things exist beneath the level of your consciousness, the Greeks denied that they're happening by your body. And so Plato actually attributes these motions to living animals inside men and women, living things, animals inside men and women. And this is where the term wandering womb comes from. Plato believes it's also the case in male genitals, not just in female physiology, female sexual physiology, but also it's a thing that's in male sexual physiology too, where there are these other animals, other living things in us that are responsible ultimately for the motions of these reproductive organs. And Plato has to say that because these are motions that are not happening in accordance with anything we could attribute to the elements, right? There's no law governing why the woman's womb would move, for example, or male genitals would change or move due to arousal. When ultimately, if we wanted to say that these are due to motions of the elements, we can't also say, well, like, why are they not being predicted by any elemental motions? We have to instead say that this is due to sexual arousal instead. And so Plato says, well, because we clearly don't have control over these emotions, they must be due to something else, but not one of the elements and not motions of the elements. And so there has to be these living things in us that we try to calm and quell and soothe by ultimately having sex or conceiving a child, and therefore, again, anchoring the womb in place. So that's where Plato's coming from with that. Now, ultimately, the whole idea of this is that we're getting out of this a concept of organs, anatomical structures that have a purpose, that do things, that facilitate some physiological process. And that's Plato's idea, that's Plato's legacy as a thinker in physiology and in biology more generally. One important point, one important point is that this is ultimately why we call these organs. In Greek, as I said, organon meaning tool, organa in the plural. We call these organs because they are tools or instruments for achieving some physiological goal or physiological outcome thanks to the gods. The gods have given us eyes so that we might see the universe and ears so that we might hear music and so on. That's where these things are coming from. They're organs in that sense of being organa. Now, I said that I would mention Aristotle and Galen briefly, and I will. So, for example, in Parts of Animals 1.5, Aristotle says, as every instrument and every bodily member is for the sake of something, so the whole body must evidently be for the sake of some complex action. Thus the saw is made for sawing is a function, and not sawing for the saw. Similarly, the body too must somehow or other be made for the soul, and each part of it for some subordinate function to which it is adaptive. End quote. That's again Parts of Animals 1-5 from first book, book 1, chapter 5, where Aristotle's saying that these parts of our body ultimately exist for the soul, and then there might be other parts of the body that indirectly exist for the sake of some that indirectly exist for the soul because they directly exist for the sake of some body part. That's a clear reference to Plato, right? That's a clear building off Plato. Plato had said in the Timaeus that the liver helps the body, that helps the rational part of our body, the rational part of our soul, I mean, the rational part of us, control or rein in the irrational parts of us, the appetites specifically, our appetites for food and drink. Our liver helps our reason do that. So our liver serves the soul directly in that way. The spleen serves the soul indirectly because the spleen's job is to clean up after the liver. The spleen acts like a napkin. He says a kind of handkerchief to clean off the liver. Now, spleen is not doing that actively. The spleen is doing that in the same way sponges absorb things that absorb water, just because they're there and they're porous and they absorb it. But the gods have made the spleen have that function of indirectly serving the soul and directly serving the liver. And so Plato in the Timaeus says, for example, firstly, concerning the vessel of the head, they, the lower gods, placed the face on the front of it, and they bound organs, that is literally tools, organa, to it with forethought for the soul, and they appointed this, which is the natural front, to be that which shares in taking the lead. And of the organs, the first one they constructed was the torch-bearing eyes. End quote. And again, that last word of the use, or of that last use of the word organs in my translation is again literally tools or instruments. The Plato is operating before the word organ can mean organ. For him, it just means tool. He's talking about the gods bounding tools to the body, by having bound tools to the body for the soul. For the soul. And that's what Aristotle's picking up in Parts of Animals. And then we have Galen, who writes a whole book called On the Usefulness of Parts. This text is sometimes has its title left untranslated, and people call it De Usu Partium, on the usefulness of parts. And Galen is clearly picking up again on Plato, because at the very start of On the Usefulness of Parts, Galen says, the usefulness of all of them, i.e., different organs, is related to the soul. For the body is the instrument of the soul, and consequently, animals differ greatly in respect to their parts because their souls also differ. For some animals are brave and others timid, some are wild and others tame, and some are, so to speak, members of a state and work together for it, whereas others are, as it were, unsocial. In every case, the body is adapted to the character and facility and faculties of the soul. End quote. That is, again, right out of the passage I read of Plato's Timaeus, where he says the gods have bound all these organa, these tools, to the body for the sake of the soul. And then I illustrated the way that some organs serve the body, right, other body parts, and then only indirectly serve the soul, right? The spleen serves the liver in turn serves reason by giving or letting the rational part of us, our reason, control the appetites. I haven't really said how they do that, how the liver does that. But basically speaking, and this would be a whole topic of a whole other episode, is that Plato believes that reason, if reason has to rein our appetites in and say, stop feeling that, we shouldn't indulge that appetite. It would be inappropriate for us to indulge that desire for, say, sex. Reason suffuses the liver with all sorts of sourness and bitterness and shrivels it up, and so causes it physical pain. It's sort of like wearing a shock collar. The liver is the shock collar. And reason can pull the switch, and then the spleen cleans the liver up. Again, not actively, but absorbing all of the debris that comes from this process. So, with these passages from Aristotle and Galen, which are incredibly similar to each other, the idea of having parts of this body being adapted to the soul's needs. And so our body forms a whole organic unity, one might say, where each part supports each other and supports the whole, instead of, say, a situation where one part tries to dominate the others and actually, it being a zero sum game or something where one part can only flourish if the other parts are not. Instead, we have the idea of a body as a complex system that Plato at least thinks of as being put together by the gods. And whereas for the Hippocratic authors, it's much more like that these are just sites or for other substances to do this work. And it just so happens that these things work this way, and there is no underlying teleology. Now, as I said at the start of this episode, that the later we go in the Hippocratic corpus, especially if we look at some of the ones like on the heart or even on the surgery that were written after Plato, and on the heart, for example, was written after Aristotle. The idea is that you'd actually see a much more robust idea of teleology in these texts because they're being influenced by these thinkers. But it's Plato who's really inaugurating this idea, and it's to him we owe this debt for our concept of organ. On that note, I think it is safe to say that this suffices for our look at the origins of our concept of organs and how Greeks did physiology in this way, and how Plato changes things in a way that makes all that in which our concept of organ begins to shine through a little bit. And certainly Plato was incredibly influential in this part of science. And again, this work comes out of my forthcoming book with Cambridge University Press, Plato's Biology. But again, I don't think you'd see so much. So I don't think you'd find this a very controversial portrait of the ancient scientific landscape if, for example, you read other recent work, by Brooke Holmes or Colin Webster. On that note, I will end this episode. Thank you very much for your attention. If you want to subscribe to the Ancient Philosophy podcast, you can find it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you subscribe to podcasts. You can also find these episodes on YouTube as the Ancient Philosophy podcast. I also run a Substack, Plato's fishtrap.substack.com. And I also have a book available for purchase, An Introduction to the Ethics of Social Media, which is out already, and you can buy on Amazon or wherever you buy books. And you can also buy it directly through the publisher Hackett. And later this year, I'll have a book on this very subject come out called Plato's Biology. Thank you very much.